Caesar's authority, Caesar's kingship. That's a repeated argument in the Bible. If we're going to get Rome on our side, which we need to because Rome is a governing authority, and if we're going to get Rome on our side, we need to convince the Romans that Jesus is a threat to Rome, because to be honest, the Romans could care less if Jesus was a threat to Judaism. They could care less about that. They don't care. That's your deal. We could care less. Now, if he's a threat to Rome, if he's a threat to Caesar, we're going to get involved. But if he's just a threat to you, to your people, to your beliefs, to your religion, we could care less about that. So, over and over, you see that. Well, he's a threat. He says he's a king. He's a threat to Caesar. That's what they said before Pilate, right? Pilate says, "Are you a king?" Right? Isn't that what he asked him? "Are you a king?" And what did Jesus say? He says, "Did you come to that on your own conclusion? Or did somebody tell you that?" Right? And then he says, "I am a king." It's one of the few places in the Bible where Jesus actually attests to deity. "I am a king." Right? "But my kingdom is not of this world." Jesus doesn't come out and say that much. That's not his thing. Jesus wanted them to come to the conclusion that he was the king and he was the Messiah. He didn't come in there saying, "I'm the guy, I'm the Messiah, I'm the king, look at me." He came in doing all these things and then saying, "You need to draw a conclusion. Who do you say I am?" Yeah, that's right. The world or our world, right? That might be. Yeah, yeah. The Jews were like, to them, it was their world. Yeah. But it gives you an idea of the influence, doesn't it? Uh-uh. This has come here now, right? The virus has come here now, right? We need to eradicate it. So, so yeah, you're right. It was a deal that they were, and it is, and it gives you an idea. And really, Luke alludes to that a lot, to how big this, and even Paul says this thing wasn't done in a corner. When he's making his argument, he says this thing wasn't done in a corner. You know what's going on. You have to know. You can't not know. If you live here, you can't not know that this is going on. So yeah, it was big, and it was new, and it was exciting, and it was dangerous, and it was fearful, and it was all those things that new things are, right? So yeah, turn the world upside down. That's right. Yeah. So it was huge. Jews had a big influence. Jews were powerful, influential. They'd been there a long time. They had a lot of money. They had a lot of status. They were, what happened to them affected a lot of things. And I think it's too bad we probably don't have a better picture, a bigger picture than what we have, but we don't. It would have been interesting to have been there and to see how that worked and how the interactions worked. Because it was, there was rioting in the streets, right? Basically, it was a big thing. So Jason is going to get kind of pulled into this, and they received a pledge. That means they received a bond. They received money. So basically, Jason probably gave them a bond. That's what that means. It doesn't mean like, I swear to you, give you a pledge that I'm not for this. He received a bond from him, and probably it was not to house them anymore. That would be probably what that was, Not that he forsook what he believed or said, but he gave them what we would say a bond or a bail bond, and a pledge is what that means. And basically, he probably said, I won't let them stay in my house anymore. Because they weren't really, we got to understand, it had become, at this point, it had become the kind of a legal matter. And so we're not really talking about a faith matter as much as we're talking here about a legal matter. So it's not like they're bringing Jason before the Sanhedrin and saying, you need to renounce your Christianity or renounce your belief in Jesus. Nothing like that. This is more of a legal matter by this point. They drug him up there. They said, listen, you're causing all this trouble. Jason says, it's going to cost you some money to get out. You're going to have to put up this bail or whatever, and basically you're going to put this pledge of money, and you're going to say you're not going to house them anymore. And if we catch you doing it, guess what? You're going to lose your bond money. You're going to lose your bail money. So it's more of that type of an idea than it is, a religious type of idea, so to speak. Does that make any sense? I don't think that's kind of confusing when you read that. It's kind of like, well, they made Jason say, I don't believe that anymore. I don't really think at all that's what that is. This is more of a legal matter at this point, a Roman legal matter than it is it's not a Jewish legal matter, it's a Roman legal matter. So they released them, and they sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And they went into the synagogue of the Jews, and Luke recounts here, and this is a scripture we often use, they were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, for they received the word with great eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. So we always talk about the Berean Jews. The Berean Jews were more noble. They were more open, maybe, to looking and searching the scriptures, and we often use them as an example of searching the scriptures to see if things were true. I've heard that a lot of times in my life. I'm sure those of you that have been in the church a long time have heard that statement repeatedly, right? That they were more noble, that they searched the scriptures, examined the scriptures. And these were Old Testament scriptures, right? This isn't New Testament. There's still no New Testament here. Still no Bible like you hold in your hand. These are Old Testament scrolls. And I can just, in my mind, I can picture them rolling those scrolls and looking, because everything's scrolls, right? Codexes aren't going to come along until like the 2nd century. So, and codexes is really what we have now of Old Testaments, or old texts, ancient texts, is mostly codexes. And codexes were more books, like bound book. They were like codexes. They were like leaves. But these were still scrolls, and they're not marked with verses and chapter breaks or any of that. And I can just picture them. I mean, it would be a job, wouldn't it, to go through those and to search and to look, and oh, look at that, look at that. And they were expensive, and so I'm sure it was, I can just see like 30 people gathered around that. What does it say? What does it say? And they probably all can't read, so this guy's trying to read. It would be pretty interesting, I think. I think it would be really fascinating to have been there and watched him examining them. We don't look at it. We think, oh, well, they just all open up their Bible and turn to, Isaiah 53, let's look at verse 5. No, it wasn't anything like that. It was there, and they're poring over these scriptures, these scrolls. I think it would be fascinating to have seen that and to have been involved in that. Many of them believed, and prominent Greeks. So once again, the Greeks, we're in this mixed world, and we got Greeks and Hebrews, and so we got all this going on. So once again, we include them in the discussion, the Greeks in the discussion, and of course, Timothy's with them, right? He circumcised Timothy so he could talk to the Greeks. But now the Thessalonica Jews, they found out they're in Berea, so they came down there to cause trouble. So, just as Paul went down there, then word gets back to them. Oh, guess what? They're in Berea now. So then the Jews from Thessalonica went down to cause trouble there. So once again, Paul is leaving again. But even though he left these places, the word didn't leave. The ideas didn't leave. What Paul started didn't leave. Those things continued to grow and continued to spread and continued to, you see, just because Paul left, what he taught didn't leave, And I think we got to remember that. Churches are going to be established in these places. People are going to believe. People are going to come to the faith. Paul's planning these things. And even though they're looking at Paul as the instigator, let's get rid of Paul, but the teaching Paul left didn't leave with him. So things are growing. And Paul has people with him, like Silas and Timothy, who in this case remained there in Berea. So even though Paul left, Silas and Timothy are still there. They escorted Paul, brought him as far as Athens. And he told Silas and Timothy to come as soon as possible, and they left. And when Silas and Timothy come to him, he's actually going to send them off on their own things. So this is how this spreads, and this is what Paul's doing. So they're spending time with Paul, they're learning, they're gleaning, they're hearing what Paul's saying, and then Paul's able to send them off and to do other things. But Paul winds up in Athens. So now Paul's in Athens, and he's in this very plural theistic society, right, in Athens. And his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols. So you kind of, to me, when I read this, I kind of get the idea that Paul goes there, and then he's kind of like torn. He's kind of like, well, I'm here because I'm kind of hiding out. Maybe I ought to keep my mouth shut, but I just can't keep my mouth shut because this is just too much. So that's kind of the picture I get of it. I can't let this go on. All these idols. Now Paul calls them idols, Greek gods, right? Greek temples. Paul calls them idols, and that's what they are. As I was reading this, well, we'll talk about that in just a second. We're just almost there. So he was reading the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles. So in this case, once again, even though it doesn't say Greeks here, it says Gentiles, which maybe is a little bit broader encompassment of different society. It's still the same thing. These are God-fearing Gentiles, so still the same thing. These are still probably proselytes. He's in the synagogue. They're proselytes. Every day, in the marketplace, every day, with those happen to be present, and some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. Now, these are philosophers, and Epicurean and Stoic were two kind of different philosophical views. One being what we would call real conservative, no afterlife, no this world's it. One being a lot more open-minded to things. Two different philosophical ideas. When we start talking about philosophy, philosophers, what comes to your mind? Does that stir anything within anybody? I mean, what are philosophers? What do philosophers do? We're going to talk about a philosopher in my sermon this morning. So I thought it would be interesting. What do you think? Is there any philosophers that come to your mind? Anybody in here can think of? Huh? Yeah, Plato, Socrates were philosophers. Huh? Yeah. Modern day philosophers, there's a lot of modern day philosophers. In a sense, a lot of theologians could be considered philosophers, right? Isn't that true? I think C.S. Lewis was a philosopher in a lot of ways. I think you consider him that. Don't you? Would you kind of agree with that? And some philosophers I'm going to talk about in my sermon this morning. We're not going to give away those names. Got to wait. But yeah, there's a lot of philosophers. And what do philosophers do? By definition, what is a philosopher? What does he do? If you was to come to somebody and say, well, you're a philosopher, what would you expect him to do? That's right. They give opinions. They're people who study a lot of different things, and they come up with a philosophical opinion or a philosophical view that they propose, that philosophical view, whether that would be atheism or Christianity or Judaism, or whether that would be a philosophical view of creation or a philosophical view of the afterlife. They gather all this and they propose a view, and then people follow them, right? And it becomes kind of a cult or a religion, right? A lot of cults are started from guys who were basically philosophers, the Moonies, right? It's started by somebody who is basically a philosopher. So, right, kind of a deep thinker, right? And so that's what they are. And so that's what these guys were. And it's odd to me that they seem to be well enough of means that they could just be that. I don't really understand that concept. That's what they do all day. What do you do? I'm a philosopher. I don't know how that pays the rent. Not exactly sure how that works, but yeah. That's right. Yeah, Jay says a lot of them were, they were employees of the state, right? So they wanted to propose the views of the state. Yeah. So philosophers, as is the case today, right? They can be either popular or they can be unpopular, right? And in those days, that could carry a great price. And I'm sure some of them were supported by donations of their teaching or whatever. So I'm sure there was a lot of different ways they garnered support. But I think it's interesting, something we don't think about today. I mean, we don't have philosophers out on the street arguing philosophy, right? It's not something that we have. So I guess they do that through blogs today, right? Instead of through on the streets. But they used to spend their time, it says. Strangers spent their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. Boy, that'd be quite the life, wouldn't it? So they were all about the gossip, right? And all about spreading it. So, and this was Athens, and there were people of means. So some of these people were probably just able to do that too. So, I mean, So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens." And this is kind of an open trial place or open forum, and there's a lot of debate about exactly what weight it carried or if it was actually like a tribunal, or there's a lot of argument about that. But he stands up in this. He stood up, so it kind of gives you an idea that it wasn't really an invited thing, He just, finally he'd had enough, right? I mean, that's kind of what you get. He stood up and he said, "You're very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the object of your worship," and once again, objects, idol worship, objects of your worship, and he's going to talk about that. "I also found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world,'" and goes right back to creation. And I think that's important in this setting because, that was something that was, I'm going to talk about that a little bit this morning, actually, in my sermon, but that was something that was a big thought, right? Was creation. Our clock battery's dead. Was creation. How did things come to be? And they're gods. They believe the gods created things, whether it was Zeus or all those gods. They believe they created, and then humanity, and what Paul wanted to do is go back to the beginning. This is actually the God who created everything. It's not your gods. It's the God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. Now, they had these tremendous, of course, you saw that Greek architecture, these tremendous temples, marvels of the world, basically, that they had built, these temples to these gods. And that was a big source of income, too, for people. Paul gets in the middle of that, right, with Artemis, right, and Diana, as you see in how he challenged their money-making, right, because he interfered with that. And it was a big business, and it was a big thing. And they had these big, huge temples and these statues they would sell, these gods and all these other things. And Paul here is challenging that. He says he's not served by human hands. He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far. For in him we live and move and exist, and even some of your own people have said, for we also are his children. By that he means some of their own people. So the Jews had said that, we're his children. So Paul's making this argument. It's not the same argument he would make in the synagogue, because the Jews didn't have any problem with knowing that God created everything. That wasn't an issue for them. But for the Greeks, for the men in Athens, that was a different story. So Paul is going all the way back to this creation, and man come from one person. That's a big thing to say that. I mean, if you're in this varied group and these varied people and these people that are against each other, and all of a sudden Paul comes along and says they all came from one man. Well, I don't really like that group of people. I don't think I'm related to them. Right? So it was a big thing to say that. I don't want to be related to them. Right? So Paul is making this big argument and about finding God and groping for him and finding God, for in him we live and move and exist. So Paul's making this huge argument for God and saying we're the children of God, and that the divine nature is not like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. Yeah. Yeah. Kind of made sense, right? I mean, this God that makes everything, what does he need from you, right? Yeah. And they kind of looked at a lot of them apostles probably as philosophers or people coming in with these new ideas. And I mean, but I think the other thing is that any philosopher, any philosophy has to be based on some sort of reasoning, some sort of logic, some sort of truth, whatever that might be. And yet here Paul goes all the way back to the beginning of creation. In other words, this is divine. This is not, this is bigger than anything you've got. But once again, not everybody's going to respond to that. And anytime you challenge thinking, you're going to meet with opposition. Paul really makes a huge statement, doesn't he? At this times, this ignorance, God at one time tolerated, right? That's Rex's winked at. Doesn't the King James says winked at or something like that? But now commands all men everywhere to repent. So Paul brings this for not just a philosophical debate. He brings it down and really puts it down to the idea that, this is something that requires your action. In other words, God's not going to tolerate this anymore. This God's not going to tolerate your ignorance anymore. He's not going to tolerate this unbelief. He commands all men everywhere to repent. Because and that's really a great question, what changed? And what does it mean that he tolerated their ignorance? That's the bigger question to me. That's always been the bigger question to me. Yeah, now that you know. Yeah, that's right. Well, Paul said, he said, I received grace and mercy because I acted in ignorance and unbelief. So Paul understood that idea that now I'm enlightened. In other words, now I know. God winked at it. God didn't hold it against me. And I think that's a big statement from Paul. Matter of fact, I think you could spend a lot of time trying to understand exactly what Paul meant there because, Paul's basic premise was, and I think because he doesn't say, I received grace and mercy because Jesus died for me. I received grace and mercy because God's going to forgive me. Paul really said, I received grace and mercy because I acted in ignorance and unbelief. In other words, Paul said there was an underlying cause of my action, and because of that, God is going to excuse that. And I think to me, that's a really hard statement in the Bible we don't spend much time on because Paul kind of alludes to the idea that if he hadn't acted in ignorance and unbelief, where would that have left him in his state of grace and mercy, Right, absolutely. It goes back to defiant sin. Right. Right. In other words, he didn't defy God. He didn't know and then defy him. But that, like you say, that opens up a whole nother huge discussion we obviously don't have time to go into, but that's a big discussion. And I think that, Paul brings that up and he brings it up here. But also it's like Brent said, you know, what about the ignorance? You know, we often talk about, what about those people that don't know God? Why do those people never heard the gospel? What about those people that are in the deep, dark recesses of the forest, rainforest, have never heard God, never heard about God? Well, I don't know. I mean, I know God's got it. I don't know the answer to the question, you know, but at this point, he says that the ignorance was kind of a forgiveness point, right? In other words, at one time, God winked at it. At one time, God wasn't concerned about your ignorance. But now that you know, right? Right. And I think that's the argument you use with people, like, well, when people bring that up about what's God going to do with these people that never heard the gospel. And my argument to them is that, you know, I don't know about them, but I know that you know, and you have a responsibility with that knowledge, right? You know, the biggest kick of atheism, kind of getting off my sermon a little bit this morning, but the biggest kick, I think, with a lot of atheists are people who say, I'm an atheist. This is Rex's humble opinion. But a lot of times, atheism is a really easy out. It really is. I mean, it's really easy if you can say, oh, there's no God, and I don't need to worry about it. And when I'm dead, I'm dead. I mean, that sounds kind of like a depressing way to look at life. But on the other hand, it's a real easy way to look at life. Because once you admit there's a God, once you admit there's a creator, even if you don't call him God, once you admit there's a divine creator, or there's creation and there's a divine creator, all of a sudden you have to do something with that. It's a lot easier just to say, it is not there. It reminds me of a story my mom always told, because she was talking about, she used to run for the phone company, and she was in Kansas. And if you've ever been in Kansas, especially back years ago, man, it was terrible getting gas at night. Nothing was open, and she was about to run out of gas, and she's like watching the gas gauge, and she's like, oh, I got to find a gas station. And she's like, she was recounting how she was so nervous about it, not getting gas, and the other guy was with her, and he says, oh, that happened to me once. And he goes, I just turned my dash lights off. You know, so I mean, so you know, so when you know about something, you got to kind of worry. And, you know, on the other hand, as the statement goes, right, ignorance is often bliss. Am I right? Ignorance is often bliss. So there's a lot to this, I think, in that respect, and we'll talk about that this morning. So Paul went out of their midst, but of course some believed, Dionysius and a woman named Damaris and others with them. So, you know, Luke throws us some names. He goes to Corinth, and this is where we get introduced to Aquila and Priscilla, which they become, you know, that's going to become something in the book of Acts. What's going to go on with them is going to become something, and that's where we get introduced to them. He was of the same trade, tent makers, right? We know Paul was a tent maker. He was reasoning in the synagogue. And when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word. That's really a lot in 5. And I think it goes back to the women that he was talking about in Berea and those places. Because I believe he's told Silas and Timothy to come and meet him. Remember that, as soon as they could, to come and meet him. And we talked about the prominent women, and there were women of substance. And I think if you really kind of put some stuff together here, and I mean, maybe you shouldn't do that, but I think if you kind of put some stuff together here, you kind of get the idea that maybe the reason Paul devoted himself totally to the word was because he received some financial support through Silas and Timothy, through those people in other towns. That's kind of a jump, but it kind of makes sense, because Paul's having to work as a tent maker. Silas and Timothy come. All of a sudden, Paul's able to devote himself to the word. So all of a sudden, Paul he's got some support, is basically what this, I think, really is kind of what that means. Testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ, but they resisted. And he said, I'm going to the Gentiles. And that's really the fulfillment of what Jesus said to Paul, right? You know, that I'm going to send you to the Gentiles. So at this point, you kind of get the idea now. And that doesn't mean that Paul's going to never talk to a Jew again or never go into a synagogue again. But I think at this point, Paul has come to the point in his life that he's like, now the Gentiles are my concern. And I'm not going to spend my time beating my head against the wall with these Jews. I'm going to go to the Gentiles. Not God-fearing Gentiles, not God-fearing Greeks, but to the actual Gentiles. People who had never heard. I'm going to plow fresh ground, is what Paul's saying. And he'll allude to that. I want to go and preach the gospel where people have never heard about God. You know, a lot of times it's easier to convert someone who doesn't know anything than to convert someone who has an idea. Right? Ideas can be dangerous things. So sometimes, you know, it's easier to do that. And I think that's what so he goes to Titus, just worse for a God whose house is next to the synagogue. And Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. And I think Luke throws that down. We're out of time. Because they're all getting baptized. But Luke just kind of throws that as a side note. That kind of gives you an idea how Luke works. You have to read the rest of this for yourself. Sosthenes is going to get beaten. That's kind of a weird case. You can read that. That might be the same Sosthenes in 1 Corinthians, possibly. So if you want to read that for yourself. We're out of time this morning. So thanks for your attention, and we shall return.